A rant today, the title over at HartmannReport.com is Trump salted the earth, and I put that in quotes, against Biden to get chaos, revenge, and profit. And I know that this is a partial list, but I think it's worth revisiting and amplified, because this is really a strategy, for lack of a better word. I mean, let's start off with salt the earth. This is a phrase. This was in a CNN report about a week after the election, or a couple weeks after the election. It was back in November of last year. And the authors of the report on CNN said some observers, pointing to Trump's rush to pull troops out of Afghanistan over unanimous objections from the military's most senior leaders, as well as NATO commanders, question whether the president and his officials are trying to salt the earth for Biden. Salt the earth? Well, most people have never heard of Abimelech, but, outside of people who are very carefully read the book of Judges back in the day, or, our yeshiva or biblical students. But Abimelech was the son of Gideon, the guy that after whom all those Bibles are in the hotels all over the place. Gideon was one of the kings of Israel. Abimelech was one of his sons. He stole all the wealth of the other sons and then killed them. He was sort of that generation's Donald Trump in a way. And they seized this town, town called Shechem. It's on the road between Jerusalem and Nazareth, going north of Jerusalem, maybe an hour's horse ride or whatever north of Jerusalem. He seized this town, and as it says in Judges 9:45, Abimelech fought against the city all that day, and he took the city and slew the people that was therein, and beat down the city and sowed it with salt. Now, what that's referring to, and this isn't the only historical reference to sowing fields with salt, but it's one of the more well-known ones. What they're referring to is that after you've defeated a people, if you want to just absolutely and utterly destroy them, you pour salt on their fields, and nothing can grow there for, in some cases, 100 years or longer. How long it takes for the rain to eventually wash the salt out, because salt is toxic to plants. So it kills the ability to grow crops. It kills the ability to grow trees. It'll kill the trees. You can't even grow grass on salted soil. And that's what Donald Trump tried to do to Joe Biden. After it became obvious that he had lost the election, he has ordered the Taliban, or he has ordered, Pakistan, to release from prison the former co-founder of the Taliban, who is now the leader of the Taliban inside Afghanistan, to release this guy, along with 5,000 of the most vicious of the fighters that they had, many of whom now have joined ISIS, apparently. And, this ISIS-K, which is now taking on the Taliban government in Afghanistan. This is going to be the next big battle in Afghanistan. It's not going to be between the Taliban and us. It's going to be between the Taliban and ISIS, and it's going to be ugly. So Trump orders these guys released. He cuts out the government. The Ghani government, Ashraf Ghani was the democratically elected president of Afghanistan. He cuts him out of the loop. Says, sorry, I'm going to negotiate this as president of the United States directly with the Taliban, a group that didn't even have a country. I'm going to negotiate with them. We let their leader out of prison. I'm going to negotiate with them. To hell with what the government in Afghanistan wants or thinks. And then his advisors came back to him, specifically Mark Esper, his Secretary of Defense, came back to him and said, don't do that. In fact, Esper, later talked about it. He said, "My concern was that President Trump, by continuing to want to withdraw American forces out of Afghanistan, undermined the agreement, which is why I objected and formally wrote a letter to him, a memo based on recommendations from the military chain of command and my senior civilian leadership, that we not go further, that we not reduce below 4,500 troops unless and until conditions were met by the Taliban. Otherwise, we'd see a number of things play out which are unfolding right now." This is what Mark Esper said like 2 weeks ago. But he was Trump's Secretary of Defense. And he said, if you're going to give this country to the Taliban, get something in exchange for it. Like, they're going to protect our people, or they're going to allow girls to go to school or something. But Trump was like, no. I lost the election. Joe Biden is going to come in. We want to hand him hell on a platter. And he did. He salted the earth of Afghanistan, metaphorically. Same thing with the COVID vaccines. Donald Trump put his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, the son of convicted swindler, Mr. Kushner, I forget his first name, Jared's dad, the one who ensnared Jared's uncle, his brother, his dad's brother, by sending a hooker over to his house so that he could videotape that and send pictures to his wife. I mean, this is just a weird family. And Jared Kushner, when his dad got out of jail, his advice to Jared was buy a newspaper, buy a big, high-profile, fancy, important building so people will take you seriously in Manhattan, and marry a very rich woman. And Jared Kushner did all three. He bought a newspaper. It's called the New York Observer. It's an obscure little New York newspaper. He paid $1.1 billion for about an $800 million building, 666 Fifth Avenue, an old office building that is now way past its prime. And he married Ivanka Trump. Trifecta. So what was happening was he bought that building on credit. And the banks were saying, that loan has now expired. You owe us $1 billion. So Jared goes over to the Middle East and says to the Saudis and the Emiratis, the UAE, help me out here. I need and the Qataris, I need some money. I need $1 billion. And the Saudis and the UAE, they say, well, get it from Qatar. They're American allies. You got a big military base there. And the folks in Qatar say, we're not going to give Jared Kushner $1 billion. Are you crazy? And so the Saudis and the UAE, this embargo, they cut off the supply lines, the food supply lines to Qatar. Qatar's this little peninsula, sticking out into the Arabian Sea that's, attached essentially to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And they barricaded them until finally, okay, we'll give Jared the $1 billion. And they did. Or at least an investment company that they're heavily invested in did. So back to my story. Jared was put in charge of the vaccine distribution, right? The whole Operation Warp Speed thing. But Jared was busy trying to work out the final deals of this $1 billion deal to bail him out of this failing building in New York City and the rest of his landlord business. He owns a bunch of low-income housing. He's a slumlord. And so Jared never made any plans to distribute the vaccine. This is a vaccine that requires dry ice. Right? It's got to be kept 80 degrees below zero. That was the Pfizer. The other one, the Moderna, has to be kept at at near freezing temperature, below freezing temperatures, below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So logistically, it's going to be complicated. How do you stage and how do you distribute these vaccines to millions of Americans? And so when Biden wins the election, he reaches out to the transition people in the White House and says, okay, what's going on with Afghanistan? And what's going on with the vaccines? And Trump and Kushner and everybody in the Trump administration said, screw you, we're not going to tell you a thing. And it wasn't until January 20th, the day that Joe Biden was sworn into office and walked over to the White House and discovered the door was locked. It wasn't until January 20th the administration discovered how bad they had been screwed, how the earth had been salted. Politico wrote a piece about this on Inauguration Day, January 20th. Quote, the Pentagon blocked members of President Joe Biden's incoming administration from gaining access to critical information about current operations, including the troop drawdown in Afghanistan and the COVID-19 vaccine distribution program. And when Mark Esper, Trump's Secretary of Defense, said, hey, you're giving Afghanistan to the Taliban and you're getting nothing in return and you're doing it in a way that's going to hurt American interests, Trump fired him and replaced him with Chris Miller. Chris Miller, who you may recall is the guy who wrote the memo that said when he wrote this memo on January 4th, saying that on January 6th, there's going to be this big event at the U.S. Capitol, and you may not, Washington, D.C. National Guard, you may not go and help the D.C. Capitol Police or the D.C. Metro Police. You may not. Chris Miller was the guy who repeatedly was receiving phone calls. He was the Secretary of Defense, repeatedly receiving phone calls from members of Congress, from the governor, Larry Hogan, the Republican governor of Maryland, calling him, saying, can I send my National Guard if you won't let the D.C. National Guard go in? Miller, nope, can't do that. Until it was reported that Trump's stormtroopers had failed in their mission to hang Mike Pence, execute Nancy Pelosi, and hijack the Electoral College ballots. When the word came out that Pelosi and Pence were safe and the ballots were intact, that was the point at which finally the Secretary of Defense, handpicked guy, says, okay. And he's still salting the earth. With promoting ivermectin and all these weird cures and just generally trashing Biden at every turn.